3. Welcome, everybody, to the latest Truth and Consequences Zoomcast. And I am really excited for today's conversation. But somebody just asked, this is actually pretty good. This is going to be a hyper negative talk. I hope not. I hope it's going to be, realistic, somewhat positive. We'll do what we can. Lauren, thanks for asking. I'm joined today by Jared Sexton. I'm really happy to have him here today. This is actually kind of a funny situation. I wrote a piece, which I've talked about a little bit earlier this week, about why I'm not overly concerned about Donald Trump still the 2024 election. And Jared, DM'd me on Twitter, sort of asking me some questions, very respectfully, I have to say. And I don't say that like a surprise, Jared. I say it's more a surprise for the medium of Twitter, in which usually people just call you a-holes if they disagree with you. But he did not. He was very respectful. We had a nice little conversation. I said, hey, you know what? Why don't you come on? We'll talk about it. So here he is. Jared, welcome. Thanks for coming today.
Thanks for having me, man. I've been waiting to meet you for a long time.
There we go. Me as well. And I'll just say, Jared, you are a professor, Georgia Southern University, right? You're in Statesboro, Georgia. And you also, of course, do the people coming in here. I have to admit them into the room. You have a Substack called Dispatches from a Collapsing State, which I've rather enjoyed catching up on some of your stuff, especially the most recent piece about Kyle Rittenhouse, which we can talk about. And you are sort of a prolific writer and Twitterer, I would say. Is that an accurate description? I don't know if maybe I've insulted you by saying that. I don't know if it's a good or
no,
bad.
I think it's accurate, but it doesn't get the distaste out of my mouth. This is what I will say.
I mean, I think Twitter is one of those things that we kind of hate, but we hate it, but we also love, because it actually is a way to communicate with people. That's pretty awesome. You have an immense number of followers. I was actually pretty happy with my number, but you've like a 250,000 Twitter followers, which is really impressive. So you got a huge platform talking to people, which is great. And that's one thing I love about Twitter. And you get to meet interesting people, as he and Jared and I did today. So it's a pretty cool opportunity for us. Oh, and I see Pete Dominic is here. That's exciting.
Oh,
Pete, glad to have you here. We've both been honored to be on Pete's show. And actually, you know what? Since Pete is here, I'm just going to mention that I believe today, or it was yesterday, was his 500th episode.
Tomorrow, I think.
Is it tomorrow? There he is. There is my friend Pete Dominic. There, our friend Pete Dominic. Congratulations.
Hi, everybody.
Everybody's friend. Everybody's friend.
Hi. Thank you. I saw that two of my favorite people were talking, and I thought I would like to sit in, and I'm only sorry I didn't wear a wig.
I'm more upset that I have to look at this handsome face and it throws me off before a serious conversation.
That's right.
Too much.
Yeah. One thing that Pete, I'm glad, appreciates, understands is that to participate in these Zoomcasts, you do have to have a beard. So I'm glad that he does that. Larry Simon, I'm looking you up there in the left corner, and, come on, let's get with the game. All right, please, if we could. All right. So we are here today to talk a little bit about how democracy, is it in peril? So I wrote this piece, as I've talked about before, basically arguing that, we have some serious threats to democracy in this country, but that Donald Trump still in the 2024 election is not necessarily one of them. And I guess this is maybe I think Jared and I kind of agree for the most. We agree more, we disagree. But I'm curious to start off by asking you, why do you think I'm wrong, or why do you think the threat of an electoral coup is more significant than perhaps I'm making it out to be?
Yeah. So to go ahead and start on this, for anybody who came here for fireworks, I don't think that this is necessarily like a complete fundamental disagreement. I think that when you and I look at this landscape, we're in agreement that there is a fundamental threat to democracy, that there is currently an anti-democratic trend in this country that is coming from the Republican Party and forces that either surround Donald Trump, propel Donald Trump. I think for the most part, Donald Trump is a complete and utter grifter who is more or less ideologically nothing, but an instinctual sort of destroyer. The people around him, however, I think are incredibly dangerous. I think you do as well. But the means that I think that we look at this situation are different. I don't think you're wrong that disenfranchisement is one of probably the leading thing to be concerned about going into 2024. If I had to sit here, and this is an unfortunate foot to start this out on, if somebody put a gun to my head right now and said, predict the 2024 election, I would have to say today that Donald Trump wins the election and we deal with the fallout after that.
Right.
I would say that disenfranchisement and those types of techniques would probably lay the foundation for those types of things. I think where you and I part ways is I think you are very focused sort of on the practical electoral politics, the mechanisms of what we're looking at here. What I study in my research and in my writing is I'm looking more at the culture that has made all of this possible.
Right.
So the disenfranchisement techniques that you're writing about, I would go ahead and argue that the cultural, political, socioeconomic factors that have made that not only acceptable and beneficial for the Republican Party, but also something that's acceptable for their base is something much, much larger than even the 2024 election.
Sure.
I'm not necessarily sitting here telling you, I'm not sounding an alarm, 2024 is going to be stolen in a coup. But I think there are precedents in American history that show us that things like that do happen. The 2000 election, I hate to tell you, was not great.
Oh no, I'm familiar.
Not great. And I think made it very clear how these types of things can take place. What I am concerned about is that different factions and different ideas within the Republican Party and within the right wing in not just the United States, but around the world are hastening and worsening these problems and conditioning the base and populations to not only accept possible coups, but violence, anti-democratic actions, and that history shows us that these kinds of things can metastasize into unpredictable changes. So for instance, with January 6th, and I would love to hear from you, because the reason I reached out to you is I think there's a fundamental difference in how we view January 6th, what it was, what its importance was.
Right.
And I think when you talk about it, and tell me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, you talk about it as a situation that occurred. The fact that it wasn't, quote unquote, successful is indicative of strength of institutions.
Yes.
And I would make the argument that January 6th was less about an electoral coup trying to interfere with an election than it was a haphazard, kind of sloppily attempted chance to reshuffle the deck, let the cards drop where they may. And when that happens, elections, electioneers, election officials, bureaucracy, those types of things, which I'm sure we're going to talk about in a moment, those things change. And it would have been more about the response to what the moment would have been than it would be even the electoral college results, all of those types of things. So I think go ahead and talk about where we sort of differ on January 6th, I think would help.
Well, I think it's funny on January 6th because I remember watching it live in my apartment, watching it and being just, absolutely, I don't know, appalled by everything that I was witnessing and something that I didn't really imagine was possible. I think as I've gotten further away from it, one thing I think has happened is that there's been a lot of assumptions about the planning for January 6th and the extent to which it was a concerted effort to overthrow an election. I don't know that I think that's actually what happened.
I don't either.
I don't. I think it, and actually in a weird way, I've been thinking about this word insurrection a lot and whether or not that really was an insurrection. And I say this because generally speaking, if there's an insurrection, the people who engage in the insurrection don't just leave when the police show up, right? And I think in a way, I do think that what happened on January 6th was horrific and everyone there should be prosecuted for what they did. But in a sense, I don't know that it was something that was planned in advance. I think it was a spontaneous act, which in some ways actually scares me a little bit more because it just shows you, I think, the sort of the trigger happy nature of Trump supporters and how they can be spurred into action. And I remember being at a lot of Trump events over the years and having that feeling, the feeling that I remember going to an event in Long Island in 2016, and it was the most terrifying political event I've ever been to. It was just scary. I was really, if you've been to Long Island and you've seen and you've been around maybe a sporting event in Long Island or a sporting event in Long Island, you can understand there's a lot of testosterone. It's a lot of just, enthusiasm. And I feel, and it was one of those things where I think if Trump had said, march, go out there and, burn down the village, I think they would have done it. And that's the part about it that scared me, that his hold over his supporters and his ability to push them into action. And I don't know that on their own, they would have done without Trump's, instigation. So I think in that sense, that's the part about Trump that scares me is his ability, the level of devotion his supporters feel to him, which I find hard to understand, obviously, but also the extent to which I think he is able to push them, to provoke them, the way that you could imagine a demagogue being able to do. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, okay, a rejoinder, because we're on similar paths here. And I'll just go ahead and say, I started sneaking into Trump rallies. That's the only reason why we're talking. That's why I gained a platform in the first place. Was in 2016, I started sneaking into Trump rallies, and I noticed exactly what you just said, that there was a growing, fervent base that, if he would have pointed and said, destroy that building, they would have destroyed the building. There was something that was growing and metastasizing there. I will go ahead and say that a large reason that I'm afraid is not just what you just laid out, but also January 6th as you laid it out. I would make the argument that January 6th was a confluence of multiple parts of the Republican Party and the right-wing project of the moment. So at the Capitol, I've laid this out. There were three main groups at the Capitol. There were MAGA supporters, right? People that wanted to be there to support Donald Trump, and they wanted to be, protesters. They wanted to be part of a moment. Many of them, by the way, wanted to live stream and, advertise their real estate businesses.
Advertise their law breaking. Yeah.
Which is a large part of what I'm getting ready to lay out, because there are economic factors in all of this as well, right? Economic motivations in all of this. So you have a bunch of MAGA supporters who are there. Many of them ended up in the Capitol, and they're like, what in the living hell are we doing in the Capitol? Okay, here we are.
Right.
And then there were two other groups that I think are really, really telling within that, because what we're talking about, I think, are tensions within the Republican Party and which tensions are going to win out. Right? You have QAnon believers.
But you think there's tension? Wait, I'm sorry. You think there's tension within the Republican Party?
I think there are tensions within the Republican Party that are currently.
Say more about that, because I'm not sure I agree, but I want to hear why you say that.
Okay, so let me go ahead and talk about the other two groups very, very quickly.
Okay, sure.
You have the MAGA supporters who basically look at Donald Trump. Most of them probably don't even have a fundamental, mature understanding of American politics, right? Because of the internal contradictions of Trumpism. Right? It's more of a populistic expression of culture than it is politics.
Yes.
Right?
I 100% agree with that.
So the two other groups, the two other groups that are in there, we have QAnon fanatics who are absolutely riddled through with conspiracy theories that make them believe the only way that the United States of America can be fixed is through a military coup or some type of anti-democratic violent action. The third group, many of these people who are a part of this are actual extremists. We're talking about paramilitary groups, we're talking about white supremacists, we're talking about people who either want to literally overthrow the government of the United States or alter it in some kind of massive fundamental way. Those three groups compressed in one place, I think, are an expression of the tensions within the Republican Party right now. And so as this thing takes place, and this is why January 6th worries me so much, there were people at January 6th who wanted to carry out a coup. Right. There were other people who wanted to protest. There were other people who were just waiting on someone like a Donald Trump to give an order, right?
Yes.
But Donald Trump will not give an order. He's a damn coward. Everything that we have seen about January 6th is he wanted to be away from it. He wanted others to make the decisions, almost like a mafioso boss, right? Which is one of the defining characteristics, I think, of Donald Trump. Those three groups are important because the MAGA supporters, if they would have been given an action, they would have done it.
Yes.
That's what concerns me, is which of those ideas sort of wins out. And I think what we're seeing is that they are coming together into not necessarily a cohesive project, but a more cohesive project.
So I have a thought here on maybe where we diverge a little bit. And maybe, I'm not saying why we diverge, maybe explanation for how I see it differently. I think you're looking at it from the perspective of Trump's supporters and the tensions there. And I'm looking at more from the perspective of Trump and the Republican Party. And I mean the elected leaders of the Republican Party, elected officials, the establishment Republican Party. And one thing I was struck by in some of the tweets, the text messages came out from Mark Meadows was how many people who say something different in public were saying to Meadows, this has to stop. And more than anybody else, the one person I'm struck by is Donald Trump Jr., who basically said this is stupid and reckless. Now, if you've done something that even Donald Trump Jr. thinks is stupid and reckless, you've accomplished something, because he's an idiot, and his whole sort of aesthetic is being stupid and reckless. And so I think even he realized this went too far. And what I keep coming back to is that Republicans, the establishment of the party, has viewed Trump for a long time as a means to an end of achieving political power, of achieving their political goals. And so when I say, for example, when I see, Republicans who come out and say that, like this thing in Minnesota yesterday, where they had this Minnesota governor's debate with Republicans running for governor, none of whom were willing to say that Biden won the election. I don't actually know how many of them actually believe that. I would imagine maybe one or two do, but I think most of them are saying this because they know it's the way to appeal to Trump's supporters. So in a way, I think that they have decided that this is the way to accomplish political power. But in the end, when push comes to shove, as we saw in 2020, many of them were not willing to jump into the pool with Trump. Many of them were not willing to, like Brad Raffensperger or Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp, I think this point, Brian Kemp in 2018, when he ran for governor, held a shotgun on his, and this, you're from Georgia.
You're talking about my governor.
You're talking about your governor, who is nuts. And yet, absolutely nuts. He held a shotgun on his daughter's boyfriend, right? And yet would not go along with Trump, because I think at the end of the day, there are significant reputational, moral, legal, ethical constraints that prevent, and even just sort of the basic democratic norms people have come to understand in this country. There are certain things you just can't do. Trump doesn't understand that. And I think one of the reasons why Trump is who he is, I made this point before, that why it's so hard to replace Trump in the Republican Party, because Trump is crazy. Trump is a narcissistic sociopath. And he really, I don't think, was bothered by what happened January 6th. I think he saw it as something that was beneficial to him. He can't empathize with people. He just literally mentally cannot do it. And so I think he didn't have a problem with it. Well, other people who are not sociopaths could say, no, this goes too far, actually. So in a sense, I think that what makes Trump, what I find why I'm not as scared about this, I think that the established Republican Party is not willing to go as far as Trump would like to go. But to your point, they are still willing to cater to his craziness. And by doing so, they are encouraging the people that you're talking about, the extremists within the Republican Party, who see him as somebody that they want to empower, but also to follow his words and follow his actions.
We disagree on this, though. This is where we depart. And here's the reason why. I think when you say that, you are speaking in a post-January 6th world where nothing happened. And you have, and I want to say that the post-January 6th world has shown us that the Republican Party now stands by January 6th and has laundered it and legitimized it. So one of the problems here, and I thought Raffensperger and Kemp, that you brought them up, was very, very telling, because again, I think you're into the electoral politics part of this, as opposed to other things. Raffensperger and Kemp, yes, they stood up and they said, you know what, the process was fine. Even though, by the way, Raffensperger, as he is fighting for his political life, has now laundered his interpretation of Donald Trump. He is now appealing to the Trumpist tradition at this point.
I'm sure he has to get elected.
The problem here, when we talk about the Electoral College and electoral politics, one of the reasons that the crisis of 2020 wasn't worse is because Trump did so poorly. It wasn't one state. It was multiple states in which multiple people would have had to have gone ahead and just kowtowed to them. Right. Instead of just Georgia, it was Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and every state that is involved in this, the window shortens. Right? Those are more and more bureaucrats who have to go ahead and say, no, I'm not going to do this, right? Or yes, I'm going to do this. And as far as the Republican Party, I think you're right about how they view Trump. Trump, of course, was the proverbial bull in the china shop, right? Everything that Trump did, because he's a dipshit asshole, he would go into these institutions and he would go in and he would do things that nobody else would do because he was reckless, stupid, and he didn't care about anything else.
Right.
And the Republican Party, and you and I both know this, they were like, oh God, what? Okay. Wait.
Right.
Oh, those pressures weren't real. Oh, those limits on power and ideas were completely within our heads. They were perceived. These institutions, and we know this, these institutions rely on people buying into their legitimacy and their power. The Republican Party watching January 6th, and I think Donald Trump Jr. is a great example of this. And also, not to mention, all of the Fox News hosts who are like, what in the living hell is going on? Make this stop. They texted it in private to Meadows. If things would have shifted, do you think that with power and control, they would have simply said, no, we're not for this? I think Donald Trump is a hell of a weather vane for it.
That's right. But I think
he wasn't going to make the order, but if he would have been given power or some sort of expanded role or control over power, he would have gone with it. He would have been more than happy to go with it.
But it's interesting because one of the things, the phenomenon we've seen with Trump is one that's played out for years in the Republican Party. And I think of this in the context of something like birtherism, right?
Yep.
You remember in 2008 when John McCain, when some woman asked him, said Obama's a Muslim, and he said, no, he's not. And this was seen as like an act of courage. Meanwhile, his vice presidential candidate was basically going around suggesting that, in fact, he was, and he was a terrorist. I think there was a disinclination to buy into this sort of birtherism nonsense. But after the election, what you saw was none of them were going to endorse birtherism, but they weren't going to also say it was wrong. They were going to wink and nod at it. And I think what Republicans have done for decades is they have winked and nodded at their base of, and I hate to use a pejorative like this, but base, I want to say crazies, but it's not the right word, base of extreme thinkers. All right, and conspiracy thinkers. And they have winked and nodded them for years because that is how they win elections, right? So you had Republicans for years who basically would play these culture war games because it would allow them to elect Republicans so they could cut taxes for rich people. And that is simplistic, but not totally inaccurate, okay? Because in reality, they didn't do much for their supporters except play to their cultural resentments and fears, which they have done repeatedly for, and I wrote a book about this from 50 years ago. They did this in the 68 election. They've done it for years. It's just become more pervasive. Trump is just one more example of it. The problem, of course, is that Trump is not controllable. And Trump actually will push things in a direction much further and much worse than any other Republican would do. And so I think that's where, I view Republican behavior toward Trump as fundamentally cynical. And I mean, deeply, deeply, deeply corrosive, but fundamentally cynical. And I think, in a way, I think I take the point you're making that look, these supporters are empowered by Trump. And I see this myself in the campaign trail, the extent to which they saw him as a kindred soul. They saw him as somebody. I'll never forget when I was in Las Vegas, and I think it was 2015. I went to a Trump rally before a Republican debate, and I asked this one guy, like, why do you like Trump? And he said, I watch him on TV, and he says what I would say when I would watch the TV. And it was almost like he would channel those resentments, those fears, that anger that was on that no other Republican was willing to channel, right? Mitt Romney and John McCain are not willing to say the kind of things that Trump would say because, they think they understand certain basic political norms. Trump doesn't. So this leads to a question, though, because I'm curious what you think about this. One thing I thought about a lot with Trump is, what if Trump dropped dead tomorrow? Yep. What if he died? What's the impact? Do you still think that this party remains as fundamentally undemocratic and almost authoritarian minded as it has become? Or do you see a shift?
Yeah, so right now, I think that Donald Trump exists as sort of the proverbial gravity of the party. Because what you just talked about, I think, is the thing that most people don't sort of reckon with, which is the Republican Party made a decision a while back, right? Which was that the intellectual Ivy League economic elites
Right.
could not win elections.
Right.
There were not enough of them. They are a very, very small of aristocratic, control, right? So of course they go into fusionism. We have to bring in libertarians. We have to bring in the kooks. We have to go ahead and take, the Birchers and sort of launder them, right? Also, we got to go ahead and bring in the white supremacists and the Dixiecrats, and we're going to put together this Frankenstein.
Because they're going to vote for the Republican Party, right? That's why.
Right.
And I hate to say this, it is a rational political thought. It is incredibly cynical and awful. It is a rational political thought.
And by the way, it worked.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
Absolutely.
Not only was it rational, it worked. It's nightmarish, but it worked.
Yes, it worked. Yes.
So eventually what happens, and this is, I think, where we're at now, where there's a strange movement on the right. And again, and everything that you're saying about 2000, my God, my mind just went back for a second. Everything you're saying about 2020 and 2024 is absolutely right when we're talking about electoral politics. But let's move beyond electoral politics. Let's move to ideology. What has actually happened within the Republican Party is the cynicism that you're talking about. That group, the people who watch Fox News, they understand it's propaganda. They understand that it's barely concealed New World Order conspiracy theory, right? White supremacist paranoia. They understand that shit is like an appeal. They understand that it's a strategy. The problem here is that the propaganda has swallowed itself. The Tea Party was a group of people who came in and they said, why aren't the Republicans acting like America is under attack? We need people who believe this. So you start having this new generation of people who live, breathe, and eat the actual propaganda. That, of course, leads to Donald Trump, who sees that as an incredible grift. And it also, espouses his worldview.
Right.
Well, what has happened at this point? What has happened is that the right is starting to crack and change and mutate. And Donald Trump is a wonderful example of this because, and we were DMing about this a little bit, there is now an apparatus that is built up around Trumpism, right? His going in and destroying all of these things, the appeals that he made, because, and this is something most people don't like to deal with, Trump's appeal was not just right wing. There are left wing elements in there, and it's all the damn over the place. And they make it very clear that old fusionism isn't going to work anymore. There has to be something new, and a large part of the people are using the authoritarian, anti-democratic elements that Trump exposed to create a new ideology of the right, and they're gaining purchase and power, I think.
Can I just pick up on one point you made? I think it's spot on, is that people think of Trump's success in 2016 as being about having conservative, right-wing extremists. And that certainly was part of it. But in the Republican primaries, his key to victory was Republican moderates. And I make this point over and over again, that in a way, support for Trump was a backlash against the extreme conservative ideology of the Republican Party, and particularly the evangelical stream. So if you look, I remember writing this piece, I think it was in spring of 2016, pointing out that if you looked at his primary support, he had big support from people who were self-described moderate Republicans, people who were not religious, who were more secular, who didn't like the religious kind of rhetoric of the far right, and who saw Trump as somebody also who pushed back on the Paul Ryans of the world who want to cut Social Security, which, by the way, you never hear about anymore from Republicans. That whole
he feels like something from the Jurassic Age.
Right. And it's like, but that whole ideology of libertarianism, of austerity, of cutting social spending, that is not part of the Republican aesthetic anymore. It really isn't. That he cut that out. Now, I do want to just make one comment, because Ron makes a great point. He says, about bringing in Birchers, which you raised. This is really new. Goldwater, for instance, this was something that happened to Republicans in the 60s. And in a sense, I make this point in my book in 68, that Nixon played to white racial fears. He played to the conservatives, but didn't, let's say, govern in a way that made conservatives happy. Conservatives actually hated Nixon's presidency. They were not happy with his presidency because he governed more as a moderate and more to the middle. But that began the process of co-opting these extremist forces within the Republican Party. And that's how you got to where you are today. I really do think this is a long-term process of Republicans, moderates, establishment Republicans recognizing the way you win elections is and the way that you push conservative ideology is you play to these cultural fears. And it has continually worked. And I would argue that playing to Trump and buying into the big lie bullshit is actually just one more cultural touch point Republicans are using to maintain electoral support.
I completely agree. And I think one of the things that we actually saw with the Birchers and of course Fusionism is there was a recognition that the paranoid style is the only means for conservatism to really replicate itself and continue to win. I'll take it back even further. And this is an argument I'm making in my new book. You know, you have, oh my God, David Brooks just needs to go away. I don't know how many columns he can write about the death of conservatism. And it was so much better when I was a conservative.
Right. Well, I was writing
the
for
the truth is that conservatism isn't just reactionary. It is a paranoid conspiracy theory ridden ideology. He talked about Edmund Burke, and this is wonderful. Edmund Burke, on one hand, is writing these beautiful things about restraining the will of the people and tradition. On the other hand, he's writing letters that are like, oh, the Jews and the Illuminati absolutely are behind this.
Right.
So, but here's the thing. If we expand it beyond America, and this is a problem, I think, actually, and this is one of the reasons why I can get into a lot of reasons why people don't want to admit that this is a developing problem. But the idea of American exceptionalism, the idea about American stability, the idea that we're immune to these things or we're immune to authoritarianism and authoritarian anti-democratic pushes, when you expand beyond that and you look at the conservative project with its conspiracy theories, its racism, its elitism, those ideas you're talking about, whether it's Bircherism, QAnonism, Illuminati conspiracy theories,
whatever it may be,
you name it. Those things, they can win elections, but they can also infect populations. And when they infect populations, they can lead to things like civil wars. They can lead to crackdowns. They can lead to coups. So I'm not telling you, and matter of fact, if somebody put a gun to my head, made me make a prediction, I think that we're going to come out on the other side of this thing. But in order to come out on the other side of it, we have to understand that there is something fundamentally rotten and dangerous that is occurring right now within right-wing politics. And we can talk about why it is and why it's happened, but we at least have to understand that it's there, that there is this infection that has taken place.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. And look, I have been, for most of my career writing about politics, sort of writing about this point that Republican Party is to a large extent irredeemable. And I don't say this because from a partisan standpoint, this is not because I lean left in my political views. It's really just it's always a funny thing. People always would say, well, you're just, that's a partisan argument. It's not. You can't look at the evidence of the evolution of the Republican Party over the past 10 to 15 years and really not come to that conclusion that the party, and I mean this, and I think maybe the best example of this, the Republican Party is not a party that actually is interested in governing, and not a party that has any recognizable policy agenda
or principles for that matter. I mean, this is a point that has made me crazy for the last couple of months, which is that I follow Marsha Blackburn in particular, but a lot of Republicans, is nuts. But like the pinned tweet on her Twitter thing is about how government should never, getting a vaccine is a choice, and government should never tell people to make that choice. You should make it on their own. And I look at that and I say, you literally believe that a woman who becomes pregnant, even if her fetus dies, is going to die, must carry that fetus to term for 9 months. The cognitive dissonance that allows people to make the argument about body autonomy for vaccines, but no body autonomy for abortion is, I can't really understand it in any recognizable way. But the purpose of conservatism hasn't ever actually been about principles.
Well, see, but here's the thing. Do you think that's true? I mean, look, I think there are, and even if I don't agree with it, I think Barry Goldwater believes, even if I think his beliefs were crazy and I think we're simplistic, I think he did really believe in conservatism. He believed in the idea that government shouldn't. I mean, Barry Goldwater was somebody who was a conservative who also said, gay marriage should be legal. right? And he should, it was not big a pro-life guy, because I think there was a recognition that conservative ideology says you should be supportive of gay marriage.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I think Goldwater's espoused conservative principles were ghostwritten by a bunch of people who were warning that corporations were taking over for the natural aristocratic class.
Okay.
The entire purpose of conservatism, listen, and I say this all the time, they're not small government. They love big government. They're not fiscally conservative. They love spending money when they have it. They're not socially conservative. The entire point of all of this, and this is why it's full of contradictions, the only thing that the conservative project is interested in is reestablishing the quote unquote natural hierarchy, which is an aristocratic idea that there are certain people who are better than other people. And for anybody listening, that means white Christian men. But that's neither here nor there.
Right.
And they will pilot society in the right means by thwarting the will of the people.
Well, can I give a different example then, maybe? Because I think Paul Ryan, for example. I think Paul Ryan, what was it?
He had principles. I agree.
That's the thing. I'm saying I think and those principles, by the way, are abhorrent. Disgusting principles that he has. But he does, it's like, what's the Big Lebowski line? At least it's an aesthetic, right? Or at least it's an ethos, right?
But can I make an argument about that real fast?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so real fast, and tell me if you agree. I wish we had 4 hours to go over this, by the way. So Paul Ryan's libertarian Ayn Rand idea of capitalism and free markets, right? I would make the argument that a belief in quote unquote free markets, which aren't really free anyway,
right.
It is actually a metaphorical representation of that hierarchy. It's saying if you let the market do what it does, it'll figure itself out. But those markets are representations of white male patriarchal interests. So I would make the argument that those principles, he believed them, but it's actually a veneer behind the actual ideology.
That's an interesting argument. And I have to sit back and think about that one. I can't. My dog is trying to get into the room over there. Hold on one second, because my dog is demanding that he go into the bedroom. So go, Baxter, go. Sorry.
Can I go on a quick rant?
I'm sorry?
Can I go on a quick rant? And I would love to hear what you have to say about this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So the entire idea of free markets and capitalism, the movement between feudalism into capitalism is basically the disinfecting of exploitation of people of color. It goes ahead and takes the people who have accumulated all this money and it says, oh, no, we're done with all that colonialism and everything's fine now and everything's going to be great. But instead you have the natural hierarchy that has the money anyway. And you say, oh, the free markets will be great. But all the money, by the way, is in the hands of white patriarchal men. So what you're actually doing is you're washing your hands of the colonial violence as it continues to perpetuate and pretending that the invisible hand makes everything happen. But it's bullshit.
But is it possible that viewpoint comes from a place of, I mean, not just privilege, but of just denial, right? If you're Paul Ryan, who grew up in a place where there weren't a lot of people of color, right? He may very well believe that if you give everybody a chance, black, white, Hispanic, whatever, they can all succeed because he did. I think there's some element here where it's not just a question of like, they purposely believe this. It's also living in denial. It's also living in a sheltered existence that doesn't understand the struggles that these people of color actually have to deal with, or people just who are not as well off as you have to deal with.
But it's also very convenient, right? I mean, it's incredibly convenient for Ronald Reagan in the 1980s to get up in front of America and say, by the way, racism's done. Good luck, everybody. Good luck with your with this race that we call the economy. You know, we're not going to interfere anymore. Meanwhile, by the way, systematic prejudice has been in place in America since its very beginning. It's incredibly convenient. And yes, I think it's what helps people like Paul Ryan sleep at night.
I'm sure.
And I have to assume the neo-fascists that you and I are sort of dancing around here, that they believe that as well, but they happen to have a closer connection to the actual violence of white patriarchal violence than the people that we're discussing who are carrying out these ideas.
But to bring it back to the current situation, I think where we will agree is that this isn't even a conversation really anymore in the Republican Party, because there is no recognizable policy agenda that defines the modern Republican Party. In other words, we can argue over whether Paul Ryan is just a cynical and sheltered conservative or he really hates people of color. But in a sense, like the Paul Ryan Republican Party don't really exist anymore. There's not that almost like strictly libertarian wing, to which they do exist. They are utterly corrupted by Trump, and their ideology is corrupted by Trump in a way that makes it sort of impossible to take anything seriously that they're arguing anymore. And look, the biggest thing that I say about this is you look at 2020, they didn't even have a fucking policy platform. They didn't know. They basically took 2016, crossed out 2016, put 2020 on, and said, "Here's our policy platform." They don't have any policy agenda, and it's even striking to look at, for example, in the current debate in Washington. That I made this point a few weeks ago in a piece that Republicans aren't even engaging in the policy discussion, right?
Oh, they're not in politics anymore.
They have no solution or ideas for universal pre-K, family. They don't even, and we just take it for granted that they have no ideas.
Well, I keep saying this all the time. Everything you need to know about the Republican Party is that in the past, if you were in the minority, if you were in the opposition and the majority put forward a plan, you put forward your own plan. And then you debated those plans in the public arena. And most of the time you lost, but occasionally you'd find it. Right. They don't put forward plans. They have no plans. The entire reason is because the Republican Party has become the public relations front of the wealthy and the white and the patriarchal. They're a cultural expression. They're not a political expression.
That part I agree with. They are a cultural
and here's what frightens me and what worries me while looking through history. They are a public relations front for concentrated capital in multinational corporations and the people who have pushed this idea of neoliberalism. The unfortunate truth is whenever the suffering that comes from things like austerity or political chaos, whenever an anti-democratic action happens, whenever an election is canceled, when a government is overthrown, whenever there's some sort of an anti-democratic movement, capital is always like, it's a little bit uncomfortable, but are people going to go to work? Okay, cool. All right, fine. Yeah, this is great. No, oh my God, what were we worried about? This is wonderful. The problem is when we talk about going back to what we began with, saying, oh my God, can you believe there was a coup when the coup doesn't work? And when the coup works, you're like, oh, that wasn't a coup. That was like putting things right. It's the way that reality shifts that concerns me.
I think that I hear what you're saying. I guess I think the more important point to make about Republicans is the cynicism of them rather than the true believerism of them. But in a way, maybe we're arguing over the head of a pin. Like I'm not sure it necessarily matters all that much.
I'll be fair because I think we're coming up on our time here. I think you and I are in different businesses. And that's not a bad thing, right? Like you're sort of focused in on the electoral politics, which, by the way, thank God somebody is, right? And we're not just talking about Dr. Seuss and Mr. Potato Head, that we're actually taking things seriously. And in your business, yes, you can look at anti-democratic actions and you can look at possible coup attempts and you can think about their applications and where focus should be. I'm out here like with the Trump crowd being like, hey, I don't know if you know about this, but they're talking about locking people up and forced lobotomies.
Right.
And what does that do? And how does that affect the political center? And so as a result, I think that people like you and me, and I'm glad we did this as opposed to doing it on Twitter, because Twitter says, you and me are in complete disagreement and we are market rivals.
Right.
And you're not serious and I'm not serious. But when we start comparing notes, I think what we find is that we have a similar understanding. It's just in different circles and different lanes.
I think that's right. And by the way, I think that if I much of what you said, I actually agree with. And I think that if I fully embraced it and wrote about it all the time, it would be very hard to write about the electoral stuff.
But I have to say, can I be real about something for a second?
Yeah.
I like to always take this thing into another thing. You're more respectable than me. Okay. No, it's true. I am seen as a wild-eyed reactionary, and I understand that. But I'm actually just trying to keep track of this stuff. I'm looking at the historical trends and the way that this stuff plays out in theoretical sense. Right. And I understand that doesn't come across on Twitter great. I get that. But like if you're going on like an MSNBC.com, you're not going to go on there and start talking about Pinochet and
Right.
neoliberal austerity enforced by the Chicago boys. Like that's not what we do, right? That's not the circles.
I
that
think
we're in.
my curse is the curse of rationality and empiricism. I think
Yes.
that I just, I look at the coup plotting and I say, but this didn't work and it's not going to work. And here are all the reasons why. And I completely understand, by the way, how people look at that and say, you're missing the forest for the trees. You're missing the much bigger picture here about the threats to the country. And instead I would say I'm not. I just see it differently. Because to me, for example, and I wrote this piece a couple of days after the MSNBC piece. What happened last week on the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court basically deciding that Texas can make a law that basically gives citizens the ability to enforce the law on their own and avoid any kind of judicial review is legitimate. It's as I think it was Sotomayor said, it is a recipe for nullification of laws, and that is basically what's happening. And that to me is far more dangerous. And as much as I might be respectable, right? My argument would be that Democrats should do, and I made this point for a year and a half, of saying they should expand the court, make DC and Puerto Rico a state, expand voting rights, and they should do it tomorrow. And every day they've waited to do that has been a huge mistake. And I make this argument not from a partisan, but from a rational perspective, that if you want to push progressive policies and you want to rebalance what is an unbalanced political system that favors conservatives and favors reactionary like the Republican Party, you need to do these things, period. And if you don't do them, you're screwed.
So if you and I, and this is another reason why I'm really glad that we're talking. I hope we do this again.
I hope so too.
One of the things,
I want to get to some questions in a second. So whenever you finish, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very quickly. So I think a lot of what you just said is exactly right. Like the Supreme Court, the fact that the Supreme Court has been ideologically driven and stolen is a consequence of the larger philosophical actions that I'm talking about. Sure. That made it possible, that made it acceptable. That also creates a situation, and you're exactly right, the Supreme Court should be expanded. We should bring in Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. But I can tell you, based on my fun out here in the frontier, if that actually did happen, there would be consequences. And I'm not just talking about electoral consequences. I'm talking about tensions growing. I'm talking about possible violence. I'm talking about a ratcheting up of rhetoric. Because out here in the frontier, that will be seen as the new world order coming into your neighborhood.
That's interesting, because I actually have a very different point of view on this. I think if on day one, Democrats had done these things that they should have done to maintain their own political power, there would have been a lot of bitching and moaning about it. Within 6 months, it would have been forgotten. Because I think at the end of the day, people don't give a fuck about procedural stuff. I'm sorry for saying that, but they don't. They don't. And I think at the end of the day, people would complain about it, but it would just become a new reality. And I think Republicans would recognize also they're dealing with a very different Democratic Party and would respond appropriately. Go ahead.
But here is the problem between these interlocking things. I'm so sorry, but you just drilled down on something really, really important, right? The problem in these interlocking lanes that we're talking about, that you and I both exist within and that we're actually addressing here, right? The problem with the Democratic Party is that they refuse to call this situation what it is. They still want to talk about this as if, well, the Republican Party has a fever. I'm sure with some ibuprofen and rest and fluids, things are going to be fine. I feel like they lack the ability to actually talk about this because, and I'm sorry, the trap of rationality and respectability. They're afraid to come out and call this situation what it is because they will be labeled wild-eyed reactionaries.
Yeah.
But it's the truth of the situation. They lack the ability to express it. And by the way, it's also part of the fact that the Democratic political project has its own issues, and that they can't come out and actually make the case that the Republican Party is the threat that they are.
You know what? I want to get to the questions. I'm going to make one last point. I disagree slightly, because I do think that if you look at, I made this point also before, that the Democratic Party today is more liberal, more unified than it's ever been probably in American history, because the parties which used to be heterogeneous are now homogenous. We basically used to have a conservative wing of the party, a liberal wing of the party. Now you have basically a liberal to moderate wing of the party. And
I disagree with that.
I'm sorry?
I disagree with that.
Okay. If you look at like Joe Manchin, and Kirsten Sinema, if these two did not exist, or if the Democrats picked up a few more seats in the Senate, I think you're looking at a very different situation. I think you would have, for example, I think you have a lot of Democrats who would be willing to, but to for example, get rid of the filibuster to extend voting rights. But to your point, and I guess this is where I will maybe agree with you a little bit, they'll push to a point, they won't push far enough, right? They won't push on DC and Puerto Rico, which and I make this point all the time, you have a return on investment. The single best thing Democrats could do to solidify their control in Washington, to ensure the progressive project continues, is to make DC and Puerto Rico a state, period. You had 4 Senate seats, you had 7 House members, and you basically make it very hard to ever lose control of the Senate. That is a huge thing. And you were right I agree with you to this point, that even without Manchin and Sinema, I'm not sure you get Democrats to do that because they're fearful of the backlash. And that is establishment thinking.
I actually think that the Democratic Party now expands from Bernie Sanders to Bill Kristol. I think the Democratic Party is now actually the United Democratic and Republican Party, and that the Republican Party is its own body at this point.
Yeah, okay.
Jumped off the cliff. So actually, I don't think it's a homogenous body at all. I actually think it's riven through with democratic socialists. Meanwhile, the Marxists over here are just smoking their cigarettes and saying no way. Then meanwhile, you have your moderates, and then you have, I'm sorry, but Joe Manchin is a Republican, a traditional Republican politician, more or less. You have a giant tent, and not just that, but because of current political realities, it's riven through with identity. There's no ability whatsoever for the Democratic Party to be a cohesive project at this point, so it doesn't do hardly anything.
Well, but see, I mean, you look at the American Rescue Plan was what, $1.9 trillion. I mean, that would have been unimaginable 10 years ago in the Republican Democratic Party. Unimaginable. You had too many moderate, and even, I mean, Manchin and Sinema went along with it. Even this Build Back Better agenda, which I still think is going to pass, not as big as it should be, which is a tragedy, but it is what it is still something that wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. So I do think in a way that I see your point, but I do think that there is, from a legislative standpoint, there's much more, the party is much more unified on its policy agenda, with a few notable outliers, and merely a handful, and that's really Manchin and to a lesser extent Sinema.
Do you think that relief package would have passed in 2008 when, of course, we have the banking crisis stuff passed?
No,
because I think it would have, and I think because it's an emergency measure.
But look at what happened in 2009. You had an $800 billion plan that Democrats in the House Democrats made smaller than they needed to be. They don't want to go over $1 trillion. I mean, you know, look at what the difference.
But I think that's the reaction. I think that's the entire point, is when you get to the banking crisis in 2008 is when you have the divergence and they go over the cliff, and everybody else, from the Democrats to the Republicans, the traditional crystal Republicans, I think are left saying, you know what, this entire thing is going to collapse unless we do something. Meanwhile, you have everybody out here, they're posing with semi-automatic rifles.
Okay, but wait, hold on. Wait a minute. I'm going to say this. In 2009, you had a Democratic president, you had a Democratic House, you had 58 Democratic senators, and they passed an $800 billion, which was not nearly commensurate to the challenge. 12 years later, they have Democratic president, they've got a 5-7 seat majority in the House, they've got a 50-50 breakdown in the Senate, and they pass a bill, you know, almost 2.5 times as large as the one they passed, and much more liberal, much more progressive. I mean, don't forget, 2008 was mostly tax cuts. This was a spending bill. So I do think that there is more consensus. It's a much more liberal party. The moderate wing of the party has been wiped out.
But it's like rising wages. It's not enough. It's still suppressed and kept.
That's fine. That's fine.
But that's what I'm saying. When you say it's more liberal or it's more left, you're right. But also time has passed. And the Republican Party is, again,
granted,
you're posing with AR-15s. They're like, we will not let communist corporations destroy us. Like it is a natural suppression of that stuff. You're not wrong, but I think it's like looking at wages and saying it's weird that those haven't gone up, or maybe they've only gone up a little bit.
Well, but you know, look, I think maybe this is where we have a different perspective on this, but politics in America, unfortunately, is an incremental evolution is an incremental process. And you know, this is how it goes. And frankly, look, your point is correct, but so is mine. That when you go,
I don't disagree. I don't disagree.
When you go from 08 to 2020 or 2021, That's a big change. But I think your point is it's not big enough. And I think you're not wrong. You're not
And
wrong.
the issue here is that we are still looking at politics like it used to be, and it has changed. It has like the snow globe has been turned upside down and it has been shaken, and people are still thinking that they're going to figure it out and reconcile these differences without some sort of a major confrontation. And I think that's where these things sort of diverge a little bit.
Right. And I think that confrontation, I think Democrats should have that confrontation. They should basically make Puerto Rico a state, and they should say, okay, fight us on this one. Because, you know, my argument, if I had Joe Manchin in front of me, I would say, or Kirsten Sinema said yesterday, we can't get rid of the filibuster and voting rights, because what might Republicans do if they get control of the Senate? And my response is, have the courage of your convictions. Do what you think is right, and go to the voters and say, here's what I did and here's why I did it. If you want it differently, vote for those guys. If you think I did the right thing for the country, vote for me. You need to have the courage of your convictions, and they don't. And a lot of them do. Most of them do.
But Michael, how will an imaginary voter in Dayton, Ohio, who's a little bit worried about civil rights, how are they going to feel about this? That's the question.
They're not going to like it.
But that's one thing. That's what the Democratic Party is concerned with. They're chasing shadows. They're chasing imaginary voters instead of trying to move the electorate, which is what they've been doing for decades now.
Yes, and for the record, that's a reason that they have a body of evidence that says that their approach is correct. You know, I don't think it's the right way to do it.
I can get you evidence to prove a lot of damn things. I got to tell you.
No, but right, you're probably sure about that. Okay, let's. I got a few things.
Yeah.
So I want to say that. So Ron Irving had a good point out Paul Ryan. He said he quoted Krugman saying the single animating principle everything Ryan did and proposed was to comfort the comfortable while afflicting the afflicted. I think it's exactly correct.
I agree. And also, by the way, Paul Ryan is the equivalent of a person who takes political science 101 and decides they're then the Speaker of the House. I mean, that's what it is. All these Randyism, like libertarian things are just completely half-baked. They have consequences that we're currently living in. They were never considered. Listen,
I have a lot of good friends of mine who are libertarians, but I will also say that I find it to be the most immature political ideology imaginable. So Larry Simon says, and I just got quick question you think about this one. You know, he said the reason why he is deeply pessimistic is because of social media. That in a heartbeat, these ideologies are spread around the globe. And I'm curious what you think about that. I'm sort of skeptical about that argument, but I'm curious if you agree with Larry on this one.
It's twofold for me. One, it has incredible properties. The problem, however, is so much of our economy and so many of our technologies are programmed in order to profit off of chaos. Like there's so much that happens within the American system of capitalism that actually goes ahead and encourages things to fall apart and for people to disagree with each other, including demographics, psychographics, segmentation, all of it. It is very, very dangerous in that regard, but it could be used for good. Those are the issues.
I think, look, I'm a big proponent. I'm a big fan of social media. I mean, I've written a book basically arguing that, you know, one of the great evolutions of the 21st century is the spread of information technology, the spread of technology that allows us to communicate with each other more effectively. But there's a downside to it, you know, and there's a downside to everything. I think the upside outweighs the downside, but, you know, I get it.
Every time a new media or medium comes around, it destroys humanity for a while. I mean,
and people say things were better in the past than they are now because of this new technology.
The printing press comes out and 11 million die in the war between Catholicism and Protestantism.
Exactly.
The entire point is that the people who embrace these new mediums are people who don't think about the consequences sometimes, and it goes ahead and leads to destruction. It doesn't mean that they're not good. I mean, you know, it's like Goebbels and the radio. They think of how they can use it to sow destruction. That's the issue.
And I want to get back to something I asked you earlier, because I think it's really an important thing about, you know, Larry, I don't know if I disagree with you so much as I think that we tend to overemphasize social media, because I do think that it's a communications tool. It's an avenue for pushing out these negative ideologies. But look, without Donald Trump, we're in a very different situation as far as certain political developments. And in a way, it's sort of, I want to get down to the nub of the issue here. Social media is not the reason why we are divided. We're divided because politicians have made the choice to divide us. And I think the reason why, for example, we're at the cusp of potentially this anti-democratic future, I think is largely because of Donald Trump. That's why I get back to my question I asked you earlier. I don't know if you really addressed it. If Donald Trump dies tomorrow,
Oh yeah.
how do things look differently?
Well, first of all, it's a plot. Obviously, the deep state got him, right? I mean, that's the truth. It's the honest to God truth. And between you and me and all of our friends and the thousands at home, the best thing that could possibly happen to the United States of America is Donald Trump dies before 2024. And I truly believe that. I think that what you would watch right now is the unraveling of a project that is coming into fruition. If it is allowed to come into fruition, that illiberal future, I think, is much, much more likely.
You know, it's a statement I hate to make, because I think everybody is redeemable. I truly believe this. Everybody's redeemable, but I think Trump is a deeply, deeply toxic force in our politics. And I don't want him to drop dead tomorrow, but I'd like him to disappear. I'd like him to simply stop doing what he's doing. And if that means, I mean, you can sort of reach in the lines of what that would mean. But I think I agree with you in the sense that so much of where we are right now is because of his mania, because of his sociopathy, because of the unwillingness of Republicans to confront him, because of the extent to which his narcissism activates the narcissism of his supporters. And if he drops dead tomorrow, I do think that Republican Party is in a very different situation.
Yes.
And I think not as reactionary, not as semi-authoritarian, which is a bizarre thing to say, that it's all about one person, but I kind of think it's true.
I think with Trump, and this actually, I think, and we don't have time to get into this, this goes into the experience of being a human. And what we learn is we do things that are often irrational, and then we make up a story afterwards about why we did it, almost simultaneously. Donald Trump is just a completely narcissistic asshole who destroys things because he doesn't respect them, because he is a craving giant center of need and wound
and validation and ego.
Validation. And he does it. And then the Republican Party, which again is without principles, they say, oh my God, look what's possible. Look what this asshole did. We can follow this. Let's construct. And right now what's happening, and this is the frightening thing for me, they're constructing the ideology around the possibility. And they're bringing in all of these elements of anti-democratic ideas, authoritarian ideas, and they're basically grafting them on a Trump-sized whole. That's the frightening part. And I think, to go along with what you said, if somehow or another he just decided, the best job in the world for Donald Trump, by the way, is ex-president. It's people saying, Mr. President.
Because he's the laziest man alive, by the way.
He has no interest in politics or the actual job.
Or working.
Or working. He wants to be the president, capital
Right.
T, capital P. And the problem is that if he continues along this path that he's already created, they're going to graft on an ideology around him, which is the process that is already underway, I think.
See, okay. Now, by the way, I wanted to mention that Pete Dominic says if Trump dies, he becomes more powerful than ever before, or whatever Obi-Wan Kenobi said, which I think there's probably something to that.
They're
but
true.
I also feel that, and I made this point, I'll use an example I would like to point to. Do you remember the Brett Kavanaugh hearings in 2018?
Wait, who? Brett Kavanaugh?
Brett Kavanaugh.
Is there a thing that happened with him? I don't.
Is
there an issue
somewhere? And Christine Blasey Ford, who obviously testified about his alleged sexual assault on her. I remember after that, Trump went to some rally and mocked her and made fun of what she had said. And I would make this point that, that's not the actions of a rational person. That's the actions of a truly horrible person. Yes. And no Republican would do that. No Republican presidential candidate would get there and literally mock her personally. He would. And of course, in doing that, his supporters found that, I guess, endearing, for lack of a better term. And my point is that that's what connected him to his supporters. He would say things and do things that most of us would say are just appalling and gross, which they found to be endearing.
Well,
I guess my thing is, no other Republican would do that. And I think there's a point here where he is so mentally unwell, he will do and say things others won't do.
I could talk about this for way too long. I will say, first of all, that I think one of the defining moments in American history was when on the campaign trail, he said that John McCain was a loser and not a war hero because he was taken.
Yes.
And what it exposed was that a lot of the performance that we have out in the world, the things that we say, the things that we do, the things that we think we're supposed to say, the things that we think we're supposed to do, were actually a veneer for who we actually are and
Such a
how we
good point.
behave.
Such a good
Donald Trump and Trumpism, and I think this is one of the reasons why it is so profoundly powerful. It has told a population within the United States of America that is unwell, that are at odds with themselves, the things that they think. Maybe they're not really confronting their own problems. It gave them license to say the problem isn't me.
Absolutely.
The problem is out there.
Absolutely.
And they're trying, and by the way, that is the essence of authoritarian fascist conspiracy theories. There's nothing wrong with us. There's nothing wrong with the country. It is an effort to make us believe that. Cultural Marxism, critical race theory, all of those things that tell us how the world actually is are attacks on us trying to weaken us. It gives you license and permission to be your worst self.
I think everything you said I agree with, and I think, and I'll just point out one of the comments Patrick says. I think that there are much more savvy people that could aim and use the weapon he created by accident with purpose and malice. And look, you may be right, but I'm skeptical of that. I'm skeptical. I just think there's something unique about Trump and unique about his particular mental illness, which, by the way, we don't talk about nearly enough. The extent to which Trump is a very, very profoundly mentally ill human individual.
Can I make a quick thing?
Sure.
On that? Here is my big concern. I've talked about this a little bit. I'm going to talk about it more later. My concern, almost like a coronavirus variant, right? Where they mix, they meet, they change, they cross over species, all of that. My concern isn't Trump. I think Trump is a symptom of a much larger disease. And his own personal pathologies exacerbate all of this, right? It's almost like where the coronavirus jumped species and suddenly it's in us.
Right.
My concern is not that. Based on my research and the things that I've looked at, my fear is if it goes ahead and crossbreeds with militarism and American exceptionalism. If you find somebody who makes the idea that you can take Trumpist ideas, anti-democratic ideas, and that you can and by the way, white supremacist cultural anger, right? If you can merge those with a directed militaristic Americanism, American empire idea, and there are a few candidates out there who I think could do it. If those things merge, that system that I think that person just brought up, or that doctrine, it suddenly takes on an ideology of itself, and it also ends up having an arm that can push it. That's my concern. I feel like I'm out here looking at immunology and how all those things could come together.
Look, it's legitimate, and I think, I guess where I maybe could come full circle is that I do think that for most American politicians, the constraints that prevent them from doing and saying the things Trump tried to do preclude that from happening. I go back to what I said earlier, that Trump's behavior on January 6th, as far as doing nothing to stop the violence, was almost uniformly opposed by all those around him, who recognized that it was wrong to do what he was doing. It was wrong to put the vice president's life at risk. After the fact, they were rather willing to simply go along with it. But I just think that what it says to me, there are limits to how far people will push that Trump doesn't have. And I think we look back on Trumpism, it's 20, 30 years in the future, we are going to say that what was most certain about Trump is that somebody who was profoundly psychologically ill was able to gain such political power, and the party apparatus around him was not willing to stand up to him. Because I don't think that you have the same kind of malevolence of a future Trumpist leader. Maybe, look, I say that, and then if Marjorie Taylor Greene runs for president in 2028, she could be the nominee of the party, and she is as crazy as he is.
Well, and I will say,
yeah.
the problem here is that Trumpism is so it's so transparent. there's nothing actually there, right? There's no ideology beyond the aggrandizement of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff that it's espousing and that it's speaking to, right? So my problem there is the mythology of Trumpism. It's strong. It started to co-opt Christianity, patriotism, xenophobic, racism, patriarchal fear, stuff like that.
It's about democracy.
My fear is a better story behind it. So his pathology is exposed all these weaknesses, brought together all these things, the shamelessness of it. My fear is when there's a larger purpose that has already been started. I think QAnonism, much like Bircherism, is going to basically infect the body. We're going to stop talking about QAnonism, but the ideas behind it are going to inspire larger mythologies, the need of a military coup, those types of things.
Let me take a different direction. Here's what I'm afraid of. What scares me more is you have somebody who's less objectionable than Trump,
right? Me
who
too.
is less psychotic than Trump.
Me too.
But has the same political and ideological goals as the establishment of the modern Republican Party. So what that means is a Ron DeSantis or not Ted Cruz, he's so unlikable, but somebody like that becomes president and just enacts, makes abortion illegal nationwide, or more directly, basically limits voting rights or makes gerrymandering so it's impossible to defeat Republican candidates. That's what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of that you have somebody less toxic than Trump, but has the same ideological goals, not as Trump, because Trump has no ideological goals. He only has goals to his own ego, but has the same ideological goals as the Republican Party. That's what I think we should be afraid of.
But Michael, you've been in the media for a while. You've seen this stuff. You've watched how people deal with anti-democratic movements, threats to democracy. The media was pissed off at Trump because he was crass, because he wasn't presidential, because he wasn't disciplined. I'm afraid of exactly what you're saying, which is somebody who comes in, they're able to be disciplined, they have an ideology, they say the right things, they salute the flag, right? They talk about all these goals, American exceptionalism. It's the scrubbing and the cleaning of the dirty, filthy, anti-project that Trump started. If it becomes legitimized and all of these Republican anti-democratic movements sort of coalesce behind it, and on top of that, the middle class, the media class, all of that is fine with it because it's not Trump, those things are bad.
No, you're right. Bad. You're right. And I'll mention one thing here, that when in 2015, one of my favorite pieces I wrote for the Globe was where I said Donald Trump is a liar. And my editor was like, you can't say that. I said, but he's lying. We can show he's lying. And it was about this thing where he claimed that that Muslims were in New Jersey were cheering in 9/11, which wasn't true. And there was no evidence for it. And I said he was pointing out it wasn't true, and he kept saying it, which means he's a liar. He knows this isn't true, and he's still saying it. So my editor finally relented that you can say it. And I remember that it was a big deal because we didn't want to say someone's a liar. Can't get inside of their head. And then within 3 or 4 years, everyone said he's a liar. I do think media has woken up to it, but I think your point is actually really spot on. Even with what I said, that people will say this person is lying and dishonest, but they're not like Donald Trump. So somehow they're more acceptable. Somehow they're more reasonable. And you're right, that is a real fear. And I think, someone mentions Tom Cotton is this, and Tom Cotton is like just dead behind the eye. That's yes. Why I call him the senator from dead behind the eye.
He looks like a bass that has been pulled out of the water.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's just like, what is going on?
I mean, that guy scares, there's no doubt in my mind that his inner life, it must be just the most effed up thing imaginable. There's something wrong with him, but he scares the hell out of me. But he's the kind of, and I don't think he is, and I think Lauren says he's a snorefest, no charisma. I agree, actually. And that's, by the way, why I came back to Trump. That Trump has that charisma. I find Trump to be the most, I don't know, just disgusting person. But I do get that people find him charismatic. They find him interesting for whatever reason. And I don't know that the Republican can maintain that kind of charisma, but they can certainly enact policies that are terrible. And that's what I think we should be most afraid of, because that's what's going to happen if another Republican wins in 2024, 2028, who's not Trump, right? Because the anti-democratic spirit taking over the party, the desire to basically corrupt the political system to allow Republicans to remain in office forever, that still exists and it's not going away. And you saw with Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell, who is an awful human being and a narcissist as well, basically spent the entire Trump years seating the federal judiciary with conservative judges. I don't believe he did it because he cares about their rulings. He did it to maintain Republican power. That's why he did it.
And did it without one compelling, charismatic speech in his entire tenure. Yeah.
I mean, exactly. I mean, no one I think really even likes this person. And his own caucus, I don't think they even like him that much. I mean, Trump picks on him all the time. Nobody cares. No one defends him. But the thing is that McConnell, if you don't care about the consequences of your actions, if you just care about maintaining political power, you can do that in our system. And that's what he has done. And that's what I'm afraid of, I'm less afraid of Trump. I'm more afraid of a Republican who's more effective than him, basically pushing through the ideology, not of him, but of the Republican Party, which is really an ideology of political power, not about policy at all.
Completely agree.
Yeah. You know what? That's a good place for us to stop, actually, because we've been an hour and 20 minutes. This was a fantastic conversation. I want to apply to Judith, who was on earlier, who raised her hand and who I think left because I didn't get her to comment on stream. I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry, Judith.
Later, Judith, come back. I'm sorry. It was hard for us to stop here because it was such a great conversation. Jared, thank you so much for coming. We need to do this again. This was a great conversation.
I am extending officially an invite to you to come on to the Muckrake podcast. We'll get on there. We'll figure out a day that we don't have things to do, and we'll put out something that officially 10 people will listen to.
Okay, but we'll have fun doing. And I also would say that for all those people on here still who are or subscribers to Jared's newsletter, I am going to send him an offer for you to join Truth and Consequences at 20% off. So I hope you can join here and become a subscriber and read the Truth and Consequences. And of course, if you are a subscriber to Truth and Consequences, please subscribe to Jared's Substack. And I'm going to forget the name, Dispatches from a Collapsing State. Check it out. Actually, I'm going to put it right here in the chat so you can read it, and I will definitely include it in the with what's it called? I'm having a problem here. I will put it in the chat. For some reason it's only going to one person.
Well, welcome to that
everyone. There we go. So now you can get that. Join up, subscribe. It's great stuff. This was awesome. Sarah, thank you so much. And
thanks, buddy.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody. Thanks again.